just
Okay.
yeah. The TV was. Bit of an introduction about myself. The clarification: I am working on my PhD. I'm not doctorate yet. Hopefully, it'll be done soon. I'm working on my first chapter right now. And I'm on my way to India to do some field work. So I have over here a bit of an introduction about myself, because even the idea of being Indian is kind of complicated at times. So let's see, put this up. So places where I belong, I put the plural places because I live between places and I have an identity stretched out between places. My father is from Ladakh, which is historically called Western Tibet, and so my ethnicity is Tibetan, but I am Indian by my passport and nationality, and we will see those complications when we talk about history also in a bit. My mother is from Sikkim, which used to be an independent kingdom in 1975. While she was in high school, it became part of India. So she became Indian somewhere in the process, and therefore I am Indian too. So we live in a place called Dehradun, where my father was. He worked as a scientist and retired there, which is again in the Himalayas. So all these three places are in the Himalayan region of India, but very different from each other and different histories. So the place where I now live and work is Dehradun, which is more in the middle of these two places. So Ladakh is on the extreme north, and then Sikkim is on the east, and Dehradun is somewhere in the middle, but still on the Himalayan mountains. So all my life I've grown up in the mountains, and here I am. So Leh is the district headquarters of Ladakh. That's the Western Tibet side. If you look in the background, you can see barren hills. So most of Ladakh is like that. The main city, Leh, is at 11,500 feet. That's where we start, and we go above that for the rest of the region. This is the most populated area. I wanted to put a picture where people were actually there, but most of Ladakh is, we don't have people there, it's empty, which is quite the opposite of what people imagine India to be. In Ladakh, there are no people. Yeah, but other places in India do have a lot of people. Gangtok is where I was born. That's in Sikkim, where my mother is from, which used to be a separate kingdom. Dehradun is where I studied and now live, which is also in the Himalayas. And interestingly, to add more complexity to my identity, the school that I studied, that's a picture of that school, was run by Irish patrician brothers. So there's complexity in being who we are. A little bit about my family. That's from my wedding last year. My wife next to me, her mother and my parents there. That's us in our traditional garb, me in my Tibetan Goncha, and her in her, she's from Nagaland, which is another state in the northeast. This is me, my sister and cousins down there. So it's a mix of cultures. And that is also, again, a part of our identity, where we, with globalization, also keep moving and we become different people, and we look differently. So I wore a suit, which looks very Western. I white wore a gown, and then again, we also wore our traditional garb. So today, again, when I'm lecturing, if you feel or you think about something, you want to mention it, please do. I don't mind interruptions. I may address some things later, so I might tell you that I will get back to it in a bit, or I may stop and address it right there. So today I want to look at the early history of India, but within that I want to look at how history is shaped and how it shapes us and our world. So this is something that I want to look at today. And again, this will be just a fragment of the early history of India, because we're looking at thousands of years, and we do not have even thousands of hours to go over it right now. So what do we mean by the early history of India? Because again, that is complicated. What do we mean by India? Because India is in some ways a very recent creation. The idea of these borders that we have, where India, where we live. I call myself Indian, but I said my ethnicity is Tibetan, right? And recently there was the Chinese army was in one of my areas. They were walking in my area. So what happens if the Chinese army invades and I become Chinese? right? So borders are complicated. The definition of India is complicated. So by early Indian history, we actually mean a broad area which covers parts of Pakistan, Afghanistan in the present, all these areas which Dr. Stevenson mentioned are part of the subcontinent. So there is this larger entity, geographical entity called the subcontinent of India, which includes all these areas. And Nepal is part of it, Bhutan is part of it, Sri Lanka is part of it. The subcontinent is a large area. No, you're good. Okay. So with that disclaimer that we will be talking about history, but the history is complicated, the region is complicated, and sometimes it's easy to forget that in the present when we see borders as clearly defined or real entities, but borders are always moving. So let's get into some of the history. So prehistory is what we look at, and this is the region that I'm looking at. If you see in present day borders, we draw it, Pakistan is part of this. Let me just get here. This is India, with this area is Pakistan, and right up there is, you see Kabul over there, where a lot of political stuff is happening right now, a lot of tensions there, so that's Afghanistan. All these areas are covered within it. Within this area, there was a huge civilization, which is called Indus civilization by some Indus Valley civilization by others. Like many civilizations of the past, this was around the Indus River, which is a huge, like very long river, which stretches across from India to Pakistan. A part of it even goes into China. So it's a very long river, and civilization was around this. So historically, we see most civilizations come around water bodies because water is necessary, and without water, they die out. I want you to pay attention to two cities over here, Harappa over here and Mohenjo-Daro over here. These were the two key sites that were found. And what makes people think that this is a civilization? So that's a key question we need to keep in mind. Why is this a civilization, and what differentiates it from other settlements found before? So the two main sites, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, discovered in the 1920s. Before this, people thought this group of people called the Indo-Aryans, and some very sketchy parts of history are connected to the Aryan word. But they said these people were creators of the first cultures in the subcontinent of India. But when they discovered this, these two sites, they were much older than the Aryan history that they had. These were as early as 3000, 4000 BC. So we're looking at very close to or right after Mesopotamian, Egyptian civilization. So these are parallel civilizations. We need to also note that they have found other sites in this connected region, like Meghalaya, which may be even older, as old as 7000 BC. But what makes these two sites significant, and what made archaeologists and historians later call this a civilization, is the fact that there were some similarities between these two main sites. That they were not, Meghar, the site that they found, which was as old as 7000 BC, may have been just an agricultural settlement. So it was not, they didn't find anything around it which looked similar. Please come in here.
This is Historia?
Yes. So we're just getting started on the early history of India, looking at two sites. But these two sites that were found, they have some clear similarities, even though they were 350 miles away. And now, in the present age, with airplanes and cars and highways, 350 miles may not seem that way. But imagine in the past when your best mode of transportation was, at best, a bullock cart, right? 350 miles pretty far, and you don't have paved roads. So 350 miles away, but they have very similar structures. There was an acropolis, which is like a raised part of the city, and a lower city, and they were both fortified separately. So both the upper city and the lower city had walls. They had a bath at the center of the acropolis, which may have been used for ritual stuff. And they had excellent water and sewage system, which sometimes even many modern cities do not have. So this was very interesting that even this early they had water and sewage systems, like water distribution across there was differentiation between the waste that came out of the sewage, how it went out of the city, with the water for drinking supply. It was channeled in such a way that it connected all the houses and went out of the city, and the drinking water was supplied to all the houses equally. Yes.
What year was it?
So we're looking at, for these two sites, we're looking at around 3000 BC.
Okay.
Or even, but
Did they already have water sewage at that time?
water shortage?
Water sewage that time?
Oh yeah, they had a separate water and sewage system in the location.
Okay.
So as early as that, they have thought of these things. So it is interesting because this is like really early, but they had even some modern cities don't have that even today. So that is very interesting. Hello. But it was not just very utilitarian things that they found that were good there. They found sculptures, figurines, seals, showing the religious life of the people. So the people had time for art. So civilizations, when they're found in archaeology, usually they have time for art when things are more settled. If you're running away or trying to always get your next meal, you don't have time to make art. But they are making their own art. They had a developing religious system. And this, I misspelled that, that's Proto-Shiva. So Shiva is a Hindu god, but they found early, like a seal which looks like that god, and probably it's like the religion may have transferred onto the later people who came in that region. So they found elements of this in this region. So here are some pictures of the site. This is the bathhouse in the Mohenjo-Daro site. So you can see it's pretty elaborately built. Imagine this being built around 2000, 3000 BC. It's an elaborate architecture. You can see the city around it. It's pretty complex, and they had streets around, very well planned. And keep a note of this. This was not an isolated city. The other side, Harappa, also had a very similar structure. So it's almost like they had city planning going on in that era. And this is the seal of the Proto-Shiva. It's maybe hard to tell, but this is the seated figure of the god. And those are the animals, those three heads. So you see a head in front and one head there, so they're three-headed god. So this is a picture of, so it's possible that in this era, they already had a developed mythology of their gods, their origins and all. Now, what happened to the civilization? It was so great, and then things probably didn't work out. Many theories talk about probably the water supply drying because rivers change courses. So it's possible that the river course changed. Another theory is that there was a mass outbreak of some disease that killed many people and this dwindled the civilization. Because once you don't have a core amount of people, the civilization will die. Another is that invaders came in waves and destroyed the cities. So it is not clear, but all those theories are there. Most scholars go with the changing of river patterns that it dwindled the supply. So these particular sites, if you see them now, they're pretty dry, those areas. So it's possible that the river changed course and the civilization just died out. So what happened after it died? That is where the Indo-Aryans come in. And this connects with a lot of contemporary history of India as people tell it. So these Aryans were probably semi-nomadic people who came through the passes in Afghanistan. And interestingly, scholars have found relationship between the Indo-Aryan Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and the Celtic languages. There are connections between these languages that linguists have found, and it would signal that these people came from the West. But there are debates over this. So this is something I want us to look at. Some scholars will say that they came from Eastern Europe and Central Asia. This is an early theory. But in the 20th century, German historians started to say that no, they were of Germanic origin. Now, does anyone remember what happened in the 20th century with German historians? What were they trying to establish? Does anyone remember key event with German historians and Aryans, which caused
Adolf Hitler.
Yeah, a huge problem in our history. Second World War happened because of that. So you see there's a political side to history. Why were they saying these ancient people are from us who went to India and also established civilizations there? Because they're trying to establish a sense of like we are ancient and we've been civilized for many, many, many centuries, unlike you right? So they would say that. So they're trying to establish a sense of self which helps them. So history is also written in a political manner. History is not apolitical. And then there were internationalists who wrote about the Aryans. They said, no, the Aryans did not even migrate. They were always here. And why would they do that? Why would Indian nationalists want to do that? Indian nationalistic historians. What's purpose would it serve to say the Aryans were not from Europe, but they were always from here?
Divorce ourselves from.
Right, we're not connected to those people. Yeah. Secondly, we are also a proud people that we have our civilization for thousands of years. Yeah. Again, unlike you. So there's always this political side to writing history. And again, these debates continue. A famous Indian nationalist, Bal Gangadhar Tilak. Vedas are the key books or canon now of the Aryan people who came after the Indus Valley civilization. So the Indus Valley civilization died, maybe because of water supply or diseases or invaders. Then there was a gap in between. And then we see another civilization coming up in that place, the Indo-Aryan people. And Vedas are their key texts. So Bal Gangadhar Tilak, he was a very famous Indian nationalist. He wrote and said the Vedas are as old as 6th to 5th millennium BC. Now this is interesting. Think about it. The Indus Valley civilization was dated around 3000 BC, right? Maybe if we go older, to older datings, let's say 5000 BC. Why would someone talk about the Aryans who came later and say that their books are even older to 6th and 5th century, millennium BC? Why?
So people don't know about the ones that came before the Aryans.
And what happens if the Aryans are like pretty old? They would say.
Then the other ones are even older than them.
No, because they've already dated the ones which are there. They would say, oh no, we did not actually destroy your civilization. We've been civilized even before you. Gotcha. Yeah, so everyone tries to so this dating is.
So they're trying to deny whatever the destruction of the other civilization.
Exactly. So they're writing history in that way, right? Now, again, I'm not saying these dates are wrong. These are contested. Historians are always going back and forth, right? Now, this is interesting. Rig Veda, which is the oldest of the Vedas, gives insights into the daily lives of Aryans, their struggles and aspirations, their religious and philosophical ideas. Now, this book is now read as a book of religion and faith. But if you look at it, what were they sacrificing? Why were they sacrificing? Now, those things tell us about what they feared. What was a ever-present danger? So if there's a sacrifice for, let's say, rain, probably they were an agricultural society and rain was an important thing for them. If there was a sacrifice, so a famous sacrifice, which comes in the later section of the Vedas, is the sacrifice of a horse for a king. But that sacrifice comes much later in the Vedas. The earlier Vedas did not have any sacrifices for kings. What would that signal? That later they started to have kings and a more organized society. When you don't have a king, you don't need a sacrifice for a king. So even though these are interpreted as religious books, reading them also gives us an insight into what society was and how it developed. And as the Vedas came, the priorities and the sacrifices that they addressed, the rituals that they addressed kept changing, because once you're settled in a place, you have more economical, or economics becomes an important thing about your life in a city, right? So they have sacrifices for wealth and all. But if you're a nomadic people, wealth is not the most important thing, it's food. So the sacrifices change, and that tells us about the history of the people. So the shift in themes of the hymns and contents of the Veda also reflect the movement of Aryans from migration to a more settled existence and later socio-economic advances. So reading history also tells us about how people were changing. Please come here. Yeah, surprise. Okay, so this is a key thing I want us to keep in mind. Like, reading history is not just about facts, but it's also about understanding the people who were there, and also how people today read and write about those people. That reflects something about who we are and where we stand on different positions. Okay, so a famous or infamous thing about India is the caste system, right? And many people say that, oh, the caste system is evil, which is true. But then how did it come about? Now, the early Vedic times, there was a distinction between the free members of a tribe and the warrior nobility, the Kshatriya. From the Kshatriya, the warrior nobility, the king, the rajas used to come. But there were only these two things, the free people and the warrior class. And then they had Brahmins who were the priests, right? So three categories. Broader category of free people, the warriors, and the priests. Warriors brought about the king. But when they started to settle, they actually had to interact with the indigenous people also, because it is often the case that invaders do not completely destroy people. And even if you look at the history of Israel, the history of the Samaritans is an interesting one to see what happened, how people get mixed at times, right? So history is never clear cut that one people come in, the other people disappear, right? Those people remain. So when they had to interact with the indigenous people, these Aryans, what did they do? What do they call these people? They started, the local people over there were darker in complexion, and they used the idea of varna, the color, to mark a distinction between themselves, the free Aryans, and these indigenous people who were darker. But interestingly, these categories are always moving, and there's a dynamism in them. Later, the category of varna took on the meaning of caste and was applied to Aryans themselves. So you see the earlier distinction between Kshatriya, Brahmin, and the Vish. So the Kshatriya being the warriors, the Brahmin being the priests, and the Vish being a general category of free people. They got incorporated within this color scheme, which started with just saying the local people are darker than us and they're different. Now they're saying, they started associating color with purity and talking about how the Brahmins, who are the fairest, are the purest, and then we get to lower levels of purity. So we see these ideas of how we differentiate or discriminate against people comes through a history of interaction of peoples. Okay.
Was there a religious reason for that, or any deeper reason?
Good, we'll get to that right here. So a later hymn in the Rig Veda, again flashback, remember the Rig Veda, the book that told us about the culture now. Hey, come. So the Rig Veda, that book, which told us, which was one of the early books, it has a later hymn which actually talks about the sacrifice of a mythical being called Purusha, which literally translates into man. There was a man, a mythical being, who got sacrificed, and the different parts of his body were cut up and distributed, and that formed the universe. That's the myth of the Purusha in the Rig Veda. But from his different parts came the different varnas, or the different categories of society. So
I'm guessing from the feet it came the darker people.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So you see, the myth came about in some ways to make room for or create a norm for what was already being done in society. So there's an interesting interplay when we see history and read history, how we understand how religions come in, how myths are formed. It's not that sometimes in hindsight we tend to ask what you ask, like, is there a deeper religious reason for this? But sometimes the religious reason is like put in hindsight to justify what we did.
Okay.
Right? So, and again, this is a bit of a sidetrack, but in European history, we have a lot of evidence of this, where certain people are labeled as inferior, and they give a very historical, and some people even very Christian scholars also at one point were trying to give reasons for why certain areas of the world are worse off or better off, right? So we try to superimpose this history on situations to make sense of what we are doing, or give a rationale, or make ourselves feel better about what we are doing. But this hymn later became normative. Like this became the norm around which society existed. And this now, instead of saying that these were indigenous people whom we discriminated against, and therefore they are different, and we differentiate against them, they said, no, this story of Purusha is ancient, and it has always been the way. We are intrinsically different because we come from different parts of this Purusha. And the hymn that was written later became normative and tried to justify things that were done before the hymn was written. right? So you see the interplay between writing and how history is now read in retrospect.
So it's sort of like a reason to make it less worse to be racist against people.
Exactly. So justifying racism, basically, in our present words. But again, this is not, nothing stagnates in culture and history. This did not stagnate. And again, this from a Christian perspective, this is like humans are sinful, right? We'll find ways to discriminate again. So even the Aryans within themselves were not happy just pushing out the indigenous people. They started making differentiations between themselves. The warrior class also started to make differentiation: higher warrior, lower warriors, middle warriors, bottom warriors, right? So they started differentiating amongst themselves. I actually have had a friend in my engineering school. So my earlier career was in engineering. So he used to insist that we note that he is from warrior class, but from a particular village, because their history is different and higher than the other one, who's their neighbor. So he used to insist that we make sure that we clarify that. But history reveals that cultures are dynamic systems, and this is important to understand for us today when we look at our cultures and our world around, that these are not fixed systems. They're always in motion. There are some agendas people are pushing, and we need to learn and be wise to read these things in history and our present. So I want to now reflect on how this history was written by different people and why it gets interesting to understand not just history as a text about something that happened and that's fixed, but to actually reflect on why someone is writing history that way. So we've seen glimpses of this in the previous slide, but I want to get deeper into this. But before I get into that, are there any questions at this point? Any thoughts, reactions? If not, we will go on. So, early historical writings of India, the formalized history, was written by European scholars. And these began in the 18th century, but European scholars would write from ideological frameworks that they lived within, right? So this led to attitudes towards India, which were mostly highly critical, but there were some sympathetic historians. But generally, the attitude was that these were not a civilized people. They did not have logic, and their societies were not organized. But even Indian scholars who wrote later, these ideologies of the West did remain influential, because even when we write against something, we still are conversing with it. So we cannot write, no one writes in history in abstraction, no history is written in abstraction. We're always writing against someone, for someone, but always in conversation, or maybe with someone, right? So even Indian historians are molded by these early histories. So in the 18th century, we had Indologists or Orientalists. These were people who, again, a lot of European history writing has this idea of the noble savage, where they exoticize the people far away and make them into this stagnant society, which was this beautiful utopia which existed, without embracing the complexity of the people there, right? It's almost like some people would say that they make them into babies, that they were always so happy and good, and we came and spoiled it. But even that is not true. Our own, like India always had problems, but it's never been a utopia, and that is true of any other civilization. But that was a view taken by many early Indologists and Orientalists. They made it overly idealistic Indian history, which is also not true. And then they would see it as the lost wing of early European culture, and the Aryans were regarded as nearest intellectual relatives of the Europeans. Again, it's interesting. Why would they regard Aryans as the nearest intellectual relatives of the Europeans? They discovered all these amazing literature written by the Aryans. By connecting themselves to the Aryans, they're saying we are also like pretty civilized, you know. We have an ancient history, even though we've not found our books yet. But there was that part about it. And then this history even impacts India today. how we view ourselves. We talk about caste as a fixed structure. We talk about a glorious past. So even in India, these narratives are there, a glorious past. Again, India did have a glorious past, but it was not just one monolithic utopia where everyone was happy all the time. Because in India, we actually see narratives of there were streets of gold and people were all rich, which is not true. I mean, there were poor people even in that time. So history is always complex, but we tend to generalize and simplify it, right, to push our narratives. An early history written in 1817 was by James Mill. His history of British India divided the history of India into the Hindu civilization, Muslim civilization, and the British period. And this is something that scholars and most people who have an idea about India still see as Indian history or the categories. But again, think about the early slides. There was no Hindu element in that. The Indo-Aryans, we don't know what their religion was. We have artifacts of that. But Hinduism, its books, the Vedas, came from the Aryans who came much later in history. So can we say that the Indus Valley civilization was Hindu? No, because Hinduism probably did not exist at that time. So, but this British historian said there are only three periods: Hindu civilization, Muslim civilization, and British period. And many Indian Hindu nationalist historians have latched on to this and have called everyone Hindu because basically that's our history. But our history is more complicated than that. And then Mill had this inclination from, again, his ideological school that culture was had value only when it contributed to the furtherance of rationalism and individualism. So he, coming from his European setting, saw that as valuable. And by that idea, Indian civilization was useless. It had no value because it was not contributing to his ideas of rationalism or individualism. So he had a very negative critique of India. Then, because of his writing history that way, British administrators had this idea of people who were who needed to be lifted up from the ignorance to now knowledge, to the Western Enlightenment knowledge and individualism. So this gave birth to policies of progress from the British Empire in India. So you see, history and how it's written also impacts government policies because that impacts how we see the world. Now we move on. Interestingly, even amongst Europeans, there's a differentiation. British scholars, so James Mill is British, but Germans and French wrote differently. What is the difference? Most of India was colonized by the British. There were patches with French, but most of it, and at a later stage, even more of it was colonized by the British. They had administrative aspects which were more important to them. But the Germans were more free in their writing because they didn't have much economic stake in the history of India. So they wrote differently. And then Indian historians started to write, but they wrote within the European model still. But most of the Indian historians who wrote were from the higher castes. So that makes a difference in how they view history. For example, let's think about the indigenous people who were pushed out by the Aryans who invaded. Now, if the Aryan wrote the history, it'll be the history of a glorious civilization, right? But for the one who got pushed out, it's not so glorious. You may have built a really good city, but I'm not part of it, or I'm asked to live outside it. But most of the early Indian historians who wrote were from the higher castes. So the question I have at this point, and a thought I want us to ponder on, we'll get to discussion later, but who gets to write history? And who is writing history today? So that is a key thing we have to think about. And in the next generation, in the 1920s and 30s, in the Indian independence struggle was getting strong. There was a nationalistic fervor, and we started talking about a glorious past. Again, in some ways, just borrowing from the European scholars, but creating this utopian glorious past. But while our purposes were different, we were doing it so that we have nationalistic pride and we can shape our identity and thereby fight against these British, that we have a glorious past which you have stolen from us, right? So again, history was again rewritten by Indian scholars around that time. Now, we are growing in our understanding and writing of history. People are starting to write history which are more regional and local. People write histories of Bengal, Maharashtra, other parts of India. Why? Because again, right in the beginning, I said it's hard to define what is India. India as this shape, this bordered thing, has not always existed. Even when we looked at early Indian civilization, it includes Pakistan, Afghanistan, which is not our idea of India right now. So we've started writing more local histories, focusing on local issues, local stories. And this is a useful departure because it corrects the tendency to just generalize and write a general history of India. And again, I'm not saying general histories are not useful. We need that too, but we need that in conversation with more local histories. Then we've had Marxist histories coming in, Marxist philosophy, which came from Europe, but then it gave people a framework to write about history as a power struggle. And that gave voice to other people like post-colonial historians who critiqued the colonial system and said, we will write history from the perspective of the oppressed. And then we have tribal histories, and tribes are, my wife is from a tribe, and tribals are people, they're just people who the Indian government could not categorize as anything else. So they were not within the normal history of India, but they were on the margins, they had their own kingdoms, so they said, okay, you're tribals.
But they weren't oppressed either.
So they had their own history. They were not even part of India till 1947.
Okay.
But now they read Indian history and are told that they're Indian, but tribal historians have started writing histories of their own tribe.
Okay.
So that gives us more nuance and more complexity to our history. So these are some growths that we're seeing in history. And now I want to talk about how we write history. We need to write history in communities and in dialogue with each other. So again, I do not condemn early historians who wrote from their perspective, because that was their perspective. I cannot say that this person was evil for writing it that way. I may disagree with him or her, but they were writing from their perspective. But till I bring my voice into the conversation, the writing of history is not complete. So we need to write in communities and in dialogue, not just with each other right now, but even with those who wrote in the past. We're in conversation. There's a need for reflexivity, and by reflexivity, I mean looking at ourselves also, be more introspective on why do I write it the way I write it? And reflexivity comes from dialogue also, because sometimes we miss things about ourselves that the other can show us. So we write history with reflexivity. And we write history as critical realists, and this is the idea that there is a reality. So it's not all relative that I can write whatever history, you can write whatever history, and we're all happy, and that's it. No, there is a reality, because if we saw right at the beginning, early site, there was an actual site with an actual bathhouse, right? There was an actual seal found. Now we're trying to write histories and say, what was this bathhouse about? What did they do there? How did they build it? What was the purpose? Who got pushed out? Who was inside? Who was outside? We're writing all those histories, but there is a reality there that there is an actual bathhouse. So there is reality there, but we're engaged in conversation with each other. We're interpreting this reality. So that's why we need dialogue, but we write it as critical realists, because I actually am not in favor of just writing history and saying whatever your perspective is fine, because there are some real artifacts that we find, and that's where archaeology does connect with history. So some examples of history from my perspective, if you think about it. In the beginning, I said my mother was born in Sikkim, which was a separate kingdom. In 1975, while she was in high school, almost on her way to college. No, she was in high school, or middle school. It became part of India. She tells me the story that one summer they were waving flags for the Indian prime minister who came as a foreign dignitary, and the next summer they were Indians themselves, they were told, right? But now the next generation in Sikkim, they have grown up reading Indian history. They have grown up reading about the Indus Valley civilization. They have grown up reading about the Indian freedom struggle, which is ironic because Sikkim was free in some ways. It was its own kingdom, but when the British left in 1975, the British left in 1947, in 1975, Sikkim became part of India. While the British were there, Sikkim was left alone. as its own kingdom. But now, children in Sikkim in school, they will read the history of India and believe that they actually won their freedom in 1947. So this is a bit of history from my perspective and my family's perspective, my people's perspective. So it is interesting how history and its writing and its reading can shape our understanding of who we are. So I want to pose some questions at this point, and then we can open it up to more conversations. Do we have enough time for that? Yeah. Okay. What do you know about the history of your people? Connected to that, who wrote those histories? Who is writing those histories? That's also connected to that. Let's tackle the first two. Some ideas. What do you know about? I just want to hear. What do you know about your people? Who wrote those histories? Yes.
Well, I'm originally from London, but my parents are Jamaican. My grandmother is Indian. My grandmother on my dad's side is German.
Interesting.
So I'm going to do some research because there's a place in Jamaica where actually it's Indian. And now I'm fast. It's called Black River in Jamaica. And now I was like, there's one part that's called German where it's very complicated. So when I started doing my history, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is too confusing for me. So my grandfather is Scottish. And I'm like, this is just getting even more complicated.
Exactly.
So I don't even know where. It's so complicated. There's so many. So I'm going to do some research myself. When I started to, I had to stop because it gets too complicated. I say, what are we? I mean,
okay.
I'm African. I'm Jamaican. I'm German. It's confusing.
So I would encourage you to actually embrace the complexity, because, and I would argue that the idea of simplistic identities and saying that I am this is actually not true of anyone, because migration has been happening throughout human history. I mean, even for the Indus Valley civilization, we don't know where they came from, right? I mean, as far as we know, humans don't sprout out of the ground like trees. So they were not like just brought with some pollen and they started growing there. So they came from somewhere, we don't know. So the complexity is part of who we are. It's good for you that you can actually access that complexity even now. Some of us may have lost it, but we need to search more. So I would encourage you, write your history, find out about it. Complexity is reality, actually. Okay.
I actually recently found out a couple of information from my family. We were looking through last names. Some middle names, last names are part of some sort of communities, and we actually found out that I never knew that because I'm Brazilian, and Brazilians are not Brazilian. They're just part of a bunch of different countries. They came together. It's never 100% Brazilian. So it's just an interesting thing. I recently found out that my grandmother is Jewish.
Interesting.
Yes, and that for some reason my mom just told me recently, yeah, she used to speak Hebrew. I'm like, where did that come from? And that my grandpa from my dad's side is Italian.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, my great grandpa is Italian. So I don't know. I guess it's also very, a mix of everything together. Brazil is a very interesting country because it has everybody from everywhere. People from Germany, from Italy, from Israel, from Portugal, especially because it's Portuguese, so a lot of people. But
you have a large Japanese population.
Yes, a lot of Japanese and Koreans too. So there's a lot of people there. Yeah.
My case, I'm Brazilian too, and I have Poland, Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, and Indian, but not for the country, the Indian from Brazil. Indigenous
And the
people.
yeah, the natives.
Yes, the natives. So
And that is good that we know this complexity, because if you think about what we talked about, all these people trying to say that we are from this ancient people are trying to draw a very simplistic line and trying to exclude others
It's
from
very
it.
complex. It just-
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the idea of a pure race is no one is pure, right? I mean, you would literally have to just be from Adam and Eve and come in a straight line. That is really hard. So the complexity is part of everyone. Right, right.
And what I find interesting is that a lot of history books are just being changed now.
Uh-huh.
Because you just keep finding out new things, and a lot of history books are just like, there are things that I learned in like 5th grade, 6th grade that are just a complete lie. Like, this is not what happened.
Yes.
So,
Good. So that is the conversation we're engaged in, right?
yeah.
And all of you are studying history. I would encourage you to write your own histories, because no one can write that history as well as you.
And the thing that you said about perspective is very interesting too, because during World War II, I know that anybody that wasn't Jewish thought that the Jewish people actually spread diseases and that they were like, and that was their truth at the time. Yeah, and it was a law. It was a law started. The beginning of propaganda, let's say that, and that they used to show on TV as well that the concentration camps were actually good for them, and so I don't know. I just think it's very messed up, but very interesting as well to know that.
and they try to again, COVID, China.
Yes.
Exactly. So that, and that is why
People buy it, people watch TV and they just sit there and they buy it.
That's true. I'm not gonna do my research. I'm just gonna let the TV tell me what it is.
exactly, and that is why we should be cognizant of history, because we see patterns. We are human, right? We see patterns of how we do things. And if you're a good student of history, you will see these patterns, like you just saw it with COVID, China, right? It's like repeating a pattern that happened somewhere in history. We should be aware and think about it that way.
But now they have Delta.
They have Delta, yeah.
Delta from, what they say. from India.
Good, brother. Our contribution to the cause. You're welcome.
From anywhere but here.
Exactly.
That is true.
Well said, well said.
That
Right.
is true.
Everyone wants to point out where.
Americans
Yeah,
are
the history
untouchable.
been written like it came from this, but here no, here like we're perfect. What are you talking about? It's like the utopia that you were saying. But in that it is like sometimes I found that not sometimes it is comforting for some people.
Yeah.
That type of thought, because like if you bring like to let's study, let's see like the facts of this and this, that will break that idea. And
Exactly.
a lot of people don't want that.
So that is like the saying that ignorance is bliss. But is it bliss? Or just blissfully unaware?
So the Egyptians did that since the beginning. They would only write about the things that they want and
The good stuff.
yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
And so even on a micro level, like my mother's tribe, Lepcha, my mother's tribe is Lepcha, and they have a history which says they were the first people on earth and they are the pure race. Exactly. So we don't need Egyptians. We did it before everyone. So every people tries to find this pure narrative for themselves, or an idea of them being superior or better, or maybe just a good race. Yes.
I don't know if you saw in the news, but recently, I don't know which country it was. I'm not sure if it was Germany, but there was a Catholic school. I think it was in Germany, and they found a bunch of bodies of Native Americans in there.
Is that in Canada?
Canada,
Yeah.
yes, of the Native Americans. So at that time, they thought that Native Americans were just dirty people. And they would take the kids from their villages, telling the parents that it was good for them. Oh, they're gonna teach or whatever. And then with time, the stories that the Native Americans told, the ones that survived, are just so messed up.
Mhm.
And nobody did anything about it, you know, and they thought it was, oh no, it is correct because they're worse than us. Like, who defines who's better than who? Just because I'm a little bit, you know, you're a little bit whiter than me, that doesn't mean that you're better than me.
Mhm.
You know, but they just defined that Native Americans are bad. We're gonna take those 10-year-olds, we're gonna beat them, we're gonna kill them, and we're gonna tell the parents that they disappeared.
Wow.
You know, so it's just super messed up. And then they found like 220 bodies of kids under the school.
Mhm.
So that's just crazy. It's just messed
Right.
up, you know, and people thought that it was okay at the time.
Right, and that's why when I said about the critical realist approach, that there is a reality. Because sometimes people will go to the extent of saying, okay, that's your version of it, this is my version, we're all fine. But there are
There has
actual,
to be a fact.
yeah, because they found actual bodies, right?
Mhm.
So now we have to deal with that reality. So-
They made a film about it. There was actually a film about it. a documentary about
Oh, okay.
So I think the question now is, where are the bodies that are getting killed nowadays?
That's true.
That is an excellent point. Because again, the dynamism of history. History is not something just in the past. We are writing history about our present. So where are the bodies that are being buried now? Where are they? So that's why I want to encourage you, write your histories, but don't think of history as just something as fossilized in the past. We're writing history right now. Things are happening right now that we need to write about, and from different perspectives. Any other thoughts? Yeah, please go on.
Again, who is right?
Exactly, who is writing? And it is easy to sit on the sidelines and say, they're wrong, they're wrong, they're wrong. But unless we actually get down and write it, we need to contribute in the conversation. Yes.
A good example of this is the
Uh-huh.
diary. You can see the side of a Jew girl.
Exactly. And those things survive, right? When she wrote the diary, she would not have thought it'll become such an influential work. So that's why don't undervalue what you write. Because you may think that, oh, I'm writing this, who's gonna read it? You never know. So write, record things, write your perspective, bring it out there. Any other thoughts? Yes.
For me, I believe that a lot of the things that are happening now is about population control. I
Mhm.
believe the world is getting out of control, so we have to somehow do something. Every generation there's some kind of disease or something that control people. Most of the time it's man-made.
Yeah, that'll be a perspective in history that, yeah, we may need to contest that if this is for population control, or I'm not sure about that. Anyway, what else? Any other thoughts?
I like something that Professor Stinson sometimes says, which is, please correct it if I'm saying wrong. Ask me 20 years from now, 30 years from now, then you're gonna gain some perspective on
Exactly.
everything that is happening.
Exactly. So yeah, we don't know about this present one, but if we don't write it, we won't have anything to ask with later. So we need to write it still. Two other questions, and they're related. If you were to write a history of your family, church, or organization, and you can choose any, what elements would you include in that history? And why would you include those elements? If you were to write a history about your family, church, or organization. So again, there are different ways of writing history. For example, if we write about an empire, we can write about it from the perspective of the kings and the succession of kings. But we can also write about it from the perspective of the economic development. We can write about it from the people who got excluded and chased out of there, right? So if you were to write a history of your family, church, or organization, what elements would you include, and why would you include those elements?
I would include their achievements.
Achievements,
and
okay.
their beliefs.
Okay, so this is a good conversation starter. What would an achievement be? What is an achievement?
He did during his lifetime. For example, he was an engineer. My grandfather, father, for example.
Okay,
He
engine.
has today has a he has a role in the same.
Right,
So he made part of the history,
exactly.
and he brought something good.
Hmm. Excellent.
My other grandfather was German,
Uh-huh,
Jewish German,
uh-huh.
and he refused to fight on the Second World War. He fought in the first one, and he refuses to go back to Germany to fight.
Mm.
And he told my grandmother to leave Germany, and she didn't do it. And she lost it. Yeah. She and her two sisters, they were taken from their homes and killed the same day. And so he told them leave,
Mm.
and he refuses. Lost his documents. He has to go to Brazil
Mm.
to continue his life.
That's interesting. Two grandfathers. And we started off by saying that you'll write a history by listing the achievements. But two grandfathers and the achievements are very different. What is considered an achievement is different. For one, it is the education and the infrastructural contribution he made to the country.
Yes, my point of view. of
Right.
course.
Yeah, right. No, so
But the
that is an
things that I
achievement, right?
know they
For
do-
another grandfather, it's about his identity and his situation in Germany. So different aspects of our lives get highlighted when we write history. Because if you think about achievements in life, both the grandfathers must have done infinite number of things in life. But we choose to write about certain things and we highlight certain things when we write history. So writing history is always a choice we make. What do we want to highlight? Excellent examples. Thank you.
Yep, that is good.
Yes.
I would write a history about, slave based. I remember having a conversation with somebody
Uh-huh.
and he's African descendant. And they said, oh, you Jamaicans the slave babies. So I said, really? So I said, when we were taken, when they came and they took the Africans, they left, they took all the good and they left the rubbish behind.
Mhm.
You can't call me a slave baby. They call, no Africans call Jamaica the people from the Caribbean slave baby.
Oh.
Because of, we were taken on the ships and so forth. So I said to them, when it's like when you put a sacrifice before in a testament, in the sacrifice, make a sacrifice before God without spot or blemish. They couldn't even put anything before God that would have a defect.
Mhm.
You had to be pure.
Mhm.
And that's what I said. That's what was my response was. When they took us,
Mhm.
I may be a slave baby,
Uh-huh.
but I am a queen because they took the pure and they left the rubbish behind. And couldn't say nothing. So I would do a history on
Uh-huh.
how it feels to be a generation from slaves.
Excellent. And I like how you're taking that and making it a point of dignity. So that is interesting. A writing of history takes something which was something which was said to put her down, but she makes it a point of dignity. So history can also subvert narratives people have of people that you are lower, but I will rewrite this history in a way that gives my people dignity. Again, there is a real part to it. Both of them have one real part, that there was slavery. But we write about it differently and we interpret it differently. Okay, excellent. Any other thoughts or examples? How much longer do we have?